So, welcome to the show. I'm your host, Dr. Joseph Coppus, and I'm joined by my guest, Eric DeGatti, and he's going to be talking to us about human performance and evaluating motion. Welcome to the show, Eric.
Oh, great. Thanks for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah. So, I usually like to start off by asking everybody how they got into this particular field. What drove you to this profession?
So I started off in personal training and strength and conditioning a little over 20 years ago. And early on got very latched into the evaluation component of it and looking at how do I best figure out the best way to put together a program for my client, because I figure that the more I can find out about you, the better program I could write, the more efficient program I could write. And so over the first couple of years of studying not only the strength and conditioning field, but also stealing some of my brother's books. My brother's a doctor in physical therapy, and kind of combining those two worlds, was able to put together a pretty in-depth, impressive assessment, but it came with a couple challenges. The challenges, one being, is I was gathering a lot of information that I didn't end up using. And what I mean by that is so I do all this in-depth goniometric assessment, and I know exactly how many degrees of external glenohumeral rotation you have. But then when I sat down to write your program, it didn't really matter if you couldn't even touch your toes, if you didn't have a proper breathing strategy. So a lot of that local, very specific, what I call parts type of approach, I found was failing. And the interesting thing about it is that's everything that I was being taught in school. That's everything that a lot of my colleagues in both the physical therapy and sports medicine world, as well as strength and conditioning world, was the dogma that they were following. Is that, we're going to do an exercise for this specific spot, and we have an issue with their performance, or we have an issue with an injury or a dysfunction, and it's because of a tight psoas muscle or a weak glute medius muscle. And if we just stretch this and strengthen that, that'll be the answer. And I found that sometimes that works, but not always. And there was something that was missing. And that's where I started to delve more into the idea of functional movement and looking at the concepts of how we move in patterns and not in parts. And that's kind of evolved into me getting involved in a lot of teaching that I do and a lot of the work and writing that I do.
Okay. So what are some of the ways that you would assess someone from a functional standpoint?
So I was fortunate enough early on in my career to have gotten to meet Gray Cook. Gray Cook is a physical therapist from Virginia who created the functional movement screen. And at the time, it wasn't even in the functional movement screen. It was a Reebok movement screen that he was doing. And just kind of latched on to find that this was maybe the missing piece that I wasn't finding, and looking at things globally as a filter first before I go into all these local assessments. And struck up a relationship with not only Gray, but his partner Lee Burton, and that evolved into me becoming one of the lead instructors for functional movement systems and going out and teaching the FMS for athletic trainers and physical therapists and sports medicine people, as well as all sorts of people in the fitness world and all around the world, and kind of teaching this concept of looking at a basic screen. If we took all the movements we do, whether it's on a football field, whether it's in a weight room, whether it's you cleaning out your garage, we can pretty much look at that and break it down into basic compartments or categories. And this concept was brought forth by the work of people like Shirley Sarman and Dr. Vladimir Yanda, looking at things more compartmentalized and saying, okay, instead of looking at just a tight psoas and a weak glute medius, well, those parts work in a lot of different ways and a lot of different patterns. If it was truly a dysfunction of that part, well, all the patterns should be broken, right? So if I look at someone squat and lunge and bend and twist, all the patterns would be affected if it was a broken part, but it's not. And those parts work fine in some patterns, and yet they fail in others. So it's really more of a pattern specific thing. And then when you look at the basics of movements and that muscles themselves are just slaves to the nervous system, whether it's through cognitive movement, through the CNS, or reactive movement. Those are things that are really the drivers of it, and the software is really what makes us move. And so when we look at how we even take a step back even further and we look at the neural developmental sequence of how we learn how to move in the first place, I always joke when I teach is that, how many people in the room had a mom and dad who brought in a movement coach who taught you to crawl and roll and get onto your knees and stand up and walk. You didn't need it. Because that software is innate, and we kind of all go through that developmental sequence for the first 21 months of our life, and we have milestones that we should be hitting at certain markers, and that's when you go to your pediatrician and say that, are you sitting up yet? Are they eye tracking? Are they doing all the things that you should be doing at these milestones? And we know there's a dysfunction if they're not hitting those marks. Well, that's great. The problem is after 21 months, we forget to look at the quality of movement. And so now we spend the next 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years screwing it up, sitting in desks and chairs, moving poorly, having poor lifestyle, things that accumulate. And now this person now comes in for training or comes in for rehabilitation, and they've accumulated all these different dysfunctions. And we now try to take this parts approach, and we wonder why it doesn't work. And so the functional movement screening is a way to objectively look at those basic patterns, and we break it into 7 patterns of 3 higher tier patterns that are integrated on your feet movements of squatting and lunging and stepping. And then there's 4 lower tier patterns that come from our developmental movements of first looking at mobility and looking at upper body mobility and lower body mobility, as well as some of our primitive patterns that develop from when we develop our core linking through crawling and pressing ourselves up in our trunk stability, push-up, and rotary stability. So if you look at all that, we have an objective way now to say, is this pattern perfect? Is this pattern acceptable, or is this pattern poor? And on top of all that, is this pattern painful? And so by doing that, it takes some of the guesswork out of it. And now I have a filter to put it through to now say, okay, well, this person's coming in, and I'm not going to chase after parts. I can figure out where is the most dysfunctional pattern that we can start with that may be holding them back.
Absolutely. Going back to the primitive reflexes that you mentioned, if you know that somebody that you're working with, not primitive reflexes, but the developmental milestones, if you know that that person you're working with maybe didn't hit their developmental milestones, do you notice that they score worse on the functional movement screenings?
Sometimes they do it and they don't realize it. I had a fascinating story at a course I was teaching up in Calgary, where when we look at your rotary stability, which is a quadruped hands and knees position, and we ask you to reach your arm and leg both unilaterally and contralaterally across your body, and this woman did very, very well on one side, which is better than most people you'll see. But then on the other side, fell down, like really struggled on the one side. And then I started explaining the concept of where this originates from and looking at how we started off with rolling and cross patterning and then evolving that into crawling. And she said, well, that's fascinating because when I was a toddler, I broke my shoulder and I basically had to pull myself along with one arm. And now here she shows up 35 years later to a course with a SI joint problems and all sorts of dysfunctions, and nobody's been able to figure out why. And now we're looking at that there was a broken piece in that developmental sequence that never got addressed. And the irony is what she probably needs is a big part of her rehabilitation and getting her right is to teach her those cross patternings again, teach her how to roll and teach her how to connect her right arm to her left leg and vice versa, and develop some of those crawling patterns, maybe the very thing she needs to avoid a lot of these pain syndromes that she's been dealing with.
Mm-hmm. Great. So what are some ways that you would then rehab this? You mentioned that you would have her crawling and really breaking that down.
Well, and the interesting thing is when we go through the intervention process, we do it in very much the same sequence that you'll see in the neural developmental sequence. So we're going to start with just some basic floor exercises, whether it's face up or face down, and it may be something as simple as breathing. And probably one of the things that I've got the greatest awareness and awakening from in my learning in the last 5 to 10 years is the impact and power of breathing. How it has direct and indirect effects on people structurally because of the movement of the diaphragm and rib cage, and how it affects posture and everything from a direct aspect structurally. How it affects things from a physiological perspective in changing the pH of the blood and changing all these different chemical factors, and then also the psychological factors. And probably the biggest thing is that the unique thing about breathing is that it is considered part of our autonomic nervous system, meaning that it's something we don't think about, but you can actually hack your way into that, what was thought to be just an automatic system, by controlling and focusing on your breath. We can actually make a shift from a sympathetic state, which is unfortunately where most people live nowadays, with stress and poor strategies of handling those stresses and constantly being in that fight or flight, and get them into a more parasympathetic rest mode, which is going to be the ideal situation for them to create motor learning. Because if you have someone who's holding their breath and you have someone who's sympathetically overdriven, trying to create any type of motor learning is going to be almost impossible, because they're going to just sense everything innately as a danger. And so they're not going to get comfortable in a position. So if I'm trying to teach you a new positioning of your hips, you're not going to get there if you're holding your breath, because your body is going to be in this fear mode, and we need to get you to shift that through breathing. And so that's the first thing that we start with. Then from there, we'll kind of evolve that from floor exercise up into where we have a supported spine, to where we get you up into hands and knees, and doing some things out of that position, and then progressing from there into kneeling stances and postures, and then eventually progressing that up onto your feet, which if you skip steps in that process, you'll usually hit a barrier, and you'll end up getting very frustrated, because the exercise is going to be too advanced for them to create any learning. And we always say the first step in any good corrective path is that we have to first create awareness. And it's easiest to create that awareness in static postures and more fundamental positions, because then you can appreciate right to left differences. You can appreciate positions and postures of the pelvis, of the shoulders, of the foot, of the knee. And then from there, we're going to just gradually increase the challenge to have you have ownership of that posture, and then eventually layer dynamic movement on top of that.
Awesome. And just so people have a good grasp of how far-reaching that these dysfunctions, like inability to breathe appropriately, maybe inability to maintain a solid core stability, what are some examples that you've seen of maybe some far-reaching issues that these people are dealing with?
Well, there's the first thing that we talk about is the concept of regional interdependence, and what that means is that everything's being linked as a kinetic chain. And there's a concept that Mike Boyle, who's up in Boston, who's one of the leaders in our industry, came up with this concept of what they call a joint by joint approach. And if you look at how the human body stacks in all its layers, it's fascinating in that you'll see the foot, it's a very mobile area, but because of that, it generally lacks stability. And most people have, they have these issues where their arches collapse, and they have these issues where they will pronate and have all these foot and ankle issues. And that's why there's a multi-million-dollar industry selling you inserts to address those issues. The problem is, if we just address one link of that whole chain, we don't realize that there's an entire connection that's going all the way through, and you can't just pull one piece out and address it, because just above that foot that lacks stability, you have an ankle that generally lacks mobility. And if you test most people, you'll see that they lack enough dorsiflexion to even stand up straight, let alone be able to ambulate and jog and run. Then on top of that, you have a knee that generally lends itself more towards instability, and that's why we have so many knee issues coming from knees that collapse in or go valgus. And then you go up to the hip, and people complain of having very stiff hips. And then just above that, you have the lumbar spine that would generally lack stability. And you have this kind of one layer on top of each other, mobility and stability. And if we just take an approach and say, okay, well, maybe you do have stiff hips, but if you can come in, I can stretch you on a table and you'll walk out and feel like $1 million, but those hips will stiffen right back up probably by the time you get back home, because what I've created is what we call naive range of motion, meaning it's range of motion your nervous system doesn't know what to do with. You've now created length that in some cases may be harmful, meaning that the stiffening of those hips might have been as a protective mechanism because you don't have the right intrinsic core stability. Well, the hip's primary function may be to say flex or extend the hip or rotate the hip, but one of its tertiary responsibilities is to stabilize the pelvis and lumbar spine. Well, if I go and stretch that and take some of the tone out of those tissues, and now I've left your lumbar spine and pelvis very unstable, and your body's natural reflexive protective instinct is to say, this isn't safe. Look, if the core's not going to do the job, I'm going to have to stiffen up the hips just to protect this. And so all that stretching is for naught. And so when you hear about people say, well, I stretch every day and I don't get any looser, because it's not a mobility issue, because that's a motor control issue in disguise. And every time you stretch it, you actually destabilize yourself and put yourself more at risk. So when you say stretching is good or bad, I can't necessarily know that until I know the whole picture and realize that if I stretch one segment, there's probably an unstable segment above that or below that. And so if I skip those steps and I just stretch one part without putting stability above and below it, the best case scenario is just going to stiffen back up. Worst case scenario, now I've left myself more susceptible to instability in the accompanying areas.
Right. And I think that's why your topic as a whole is so important, because a lot of people like to address, like you said, regional pain. They go right for the source of pain. But if you don't look at the kinetic chain, like you were mentioning, how these things stack and affect each other down the kinetic chain, then you might be missing something and actually potentially making someone worse.
Yeah, absolutely. So two stories I give with that is one is we also have a medical model in the functional movement systems under the functional movement systems umbrella called the SFMA, which is the Selective Functional Movement Assessment. That is specifically for people in pain, whereas the FMS would be for people who are not currently in pain. Well, even when we address people who are in pain, we don't chase the pain. We look for your most dysfunctional, non-painful pattern. So if I ask you to touch your toes and it hurts, but we ask you to rotate and you have a significant deficit in one direction of rotation, well, that's going to be our most dysfunctional, non-painful pattern. We're going to work on that. And sometimes by just clearing that rotation, now you go back and touch your toes and it's not painful anymore. And then we can boil it down even further to say, okay, well, where is that deficit in rotation? Is it in the trunk? Is it in the hips? Is it somewhere in the tibia? Where could that lack of rotation be? And then when we boil it down to, okay, well, here's where we lack the rotation. Well, why do we lack the rotation? Is it a soft tissue restriction? Is this a joint mobility dysfunction? Or is it a motor control issue? So now there's really no guesswork. There's no kind of hunt and peck and just rub the parts that hurt and hope it feels better. It's going to really dial it down to where exactly is the root cause of these issues. And so I open up when I teach for FMS and kind of letting people know some of the origin of how Gray came up with the movement screen. And he gets called in to a lot of different situations to come in as a consultant, especially when there's injuries they can't figure out. And so he was called into a major university where one of their top athletes had torn his groin off the bone twice. And so he gets into this room full of all the sports medicine people, all the coaches, and all the training staff, and they're all kind of pointing fingers at each other, saying, "Well, you didn't, rehab him well enough, or you pushed him too fast, or you didn't give him enough time, or any of these issues." And while they're all arguing with each other, he says, "Well, did anybody notice that he doesn't have any dorsiflexion in this one ankle?" And they all kind of look at each other and say, "Well, this is a groin issue." And he said, "Well, let's kind of go through this history here." And he said, "Tell me what happened, with your ankle." He said, "Well, I kind of rolled it in practice, and the typical thing, they taped it up, and it didn't really think about it much after that." And he said, "Okay, well, tell me about what were the things that happened immediately after that." And he said, well, I did have this issue, and he points right to his pubis symphysis. And he says, okay, well, tell me what that is. He said, well, I had some pain there. And he starts thinking, he said, well, what were you doing at the time that created the pain? He said, well, it was I started feeling it after I was doing this high incline sprint work on a treadmill. And he said, okay, well, let's kind of trace that back. Well, if I have one ankle that can clear and the other one can't, well, I have two options as an athlete. I'm either going to face plant onto the treadmill, or I'm going to have to find a way to get this foot to clear through, and it's not going to be for my ankle. So now he has to create hiking through his hip, and that shear force was enough to create some irritation in his pubis symphysis. Well, again, they looked at it as a local issue. They go and give him a cortisone shot in his pubis symphysis, makes that pain go away, but it didn't fix the issue. And now that pain was trying to lead you down a path. That pain was saying, hey, there's something wrong here we need to address, but you went and took that signal and you shut it off. It's kind of like the analogy I use. It's kind of like if your smoke alarm's going off in your kitchen, in the middle of the night, and you go and pop the battery out. You didn't put out any fires. So now that you've deadened that signal, he goes out thinking he's fine, and boom, there goes his groin off the bone. That was the warning shot that his body was trying to give him. Well, they do the surgery, and they put him through his rehab, and they do everything in the world to his groin, of poking and prodding and rubbing and heating and icing and stimming and exercising his groin, but they never addressed the ankle, which was the root cause, and so he goes out and tears it again. And so when we go back and say, okay, how does that get missed? How do we not have a global overview of what is going on? And that's how Gray kind of started sketching out what became the movement screen we use today, is to say, we want to make sure we're not missing anything here, because yes, we may have a groin issue we have to address, but it can come from anywhere. And I can tell you a long list of case studies that have had low back issues because of an ankle, that have had hip issues because of a lack of movement in the T-spine, things that are not directly correlated but have been the driving cause. And that's why people have gone through every different modality and gotten no results, because they keep hunting down the pain, and that's not really where the issue is, and they're not addressing the dysfunction that goes along with it.
Absolutely. And I can attest to this personally. I had a torn ACL at some point, and rehabbed, whatever. I probably wasn't using my leg appropriately, and I'm a long distance runner. So eventually, about a year after, I started to develop pretty bad shoulder pain, but I never did anything in my shoulder. It happened to be the opposite shoulder, and then we know about the left knee, right shoulder, opposite cross-crawl relationship. And then I go to get it rehabbed. Everyone wants to look at my shoulder, but turns out it didn't get fixed until we addressed the knee a little further and address those mechanics appropriately.
Yeah, there's a segment that I do in a workshop that I teach, and it's called the key questions. And there's so much that can get solved if we just ask the right questions early on. I don't know, when you went for your rehab of your shoulder, how many people even asked you about, did you have anything else going on? And if you did have an ACL, how did that ACL happen? There's a big difference between my client who got a helmet full speed into his knee 2 weeks ago in a game and blew out his ACL, as opposed to someone who's running down a soccer field and just plants wrong and their ACL goes. There's two totally different cases. So unless we ask the right questions, we end up getting caught up in the chasing the pain and chasing the complaint, as opposed to really taking a step back and realize that unless you got checked into the boards or fell down a flight of stairs or got hit in a football game, I need to know this is your body kind of not figuring itself out, and it's just making up for it in other places. And so we have to look at the whole picture, and that's where a lot of this gets missed.
Absolutely.
And the same thing even goes for performance, as well. And if you look at somebody in your situation with some sort of pain or injury history, is really not that much different than I would look at somebody with a performance deficit. Is I want to just go through and check off boxes and be able to say, okay, is this a movement issue? And if it's not a movement issue, okay, well then now I can go to performance, as opposed to guessing. I'm just going to create a checklist to say, well, these are all the things that you need to show up on the field or the ice or the court and be at your best. And I'm going to just check boxes and see where the deficit is, as opposed to just chasing what's the latest and greatest trend in athletic training or strength and conditioning, because it's, as much as power development is great, and as much as there's a lot of very cool tools and tricks out there, they're only cool if that's what it is that you need. And unless you have a checklist or a system to kind of push that up against, you don't know if that's what they need, and you don't even know if it's improving if you didn't have a baseline to start with.
Yeah, absolutely. So over the course of your career, working in the FMS world, functional movement world, how much have you seen this way of thinking implemented into, the performance athletes and, colleges, pro teams, and what kind of long-term difference has that really made that you've seen?
Not as much as it should be, unfortunately, because a lot of organizations and teams like to look for the newest, coolest thing. And I've been in organizations where the whole staff goes for a kinesiotaping course, and then the next thing you know, you have everybody walking around the locker room with tape stuck to their body in some spot, whether they needed it or not, because they were going to be their practice dummies. It all comes back to pushing it through a system. Now, if you have a system of checks and balances, and then if you also have a system of a standard operating procedure and having a communication system, that's what links your medical staff to your sports medicine staff, to your training staff, to your coaching staff. And when you have that link and that clear line of communication, it takes a lot of the ego out of it. And that's really the biggest stumbling block in a lot of the organizations, is because here's the reality. If I come in and I do movement screenings on your team and everybody scores really poorly, well, it's not going to reflect well on some of the people that have been in charge of, of their strength and conditioning. So we have to be very careful that the egos don't get offended, and the higher up you go, the bigger the egos get. And so that's where some of the challenge is. Whereas, I get contracted by high schools, and we've had tremendous success because, you go into those settings, and not only is there not as much ego, but you have athletic trainers that are just begging for help, because I've never met an athletic trainer that's saying, "Oh, I wish I could just have more people in the training room." They're just dying for anybody that can put a plug in the dam of all these kids that are coming in with all these issues. And if I can cut down their workload by a quarter or half or more, then I become their best friend. And so that's where that is a huge help for both of us to be able to work together and say, okay, well, we have a pitcher on the baseball team that's dealing with some shoulder difficulties. Is this something that's a painful issue? It's a medical issue that I need to get him in the training room for, and then he or she can then take them on that course? Or is this something that, hey, look, you don't need to be bothering the trainer with this. This is something that I can show you what to do in terms of doing some soft tissue work and doing some mobility work and then doing some good motor control work to lock it all in. You can stay out of the treatment room, and you don't need to be there if we can stay ahead of this. And so that's where it can make a huge impact. And we've had schools that have been able to cut their non-contact injuries down significantly by able to implement some systems like this, where we have checks and balances, and most importantly, the very good communication system. And I teach all the athletes, unless you have a contact collision, some sort of traumatic episode, and most of your injuries, your body is going to give you a warning sign. So when something doesn't feel right, we need to communicate it right then and there before it becomes an issue. And if we can get that culture developed, then you have the kids who are coming to you and saying, I think there's something not right with my groin. And it's something as simple as giving them 3-4 things to do every day before practice, and it never becomes an issue, as opposed to that now cascades into something that becomes a bigger issue. And now they have to go to the training room, and now it's just, and now they're missing time, and now it's almost not a situation we can even save and bring back.
Yeah. So if I'm an interested parent, patient, or athlete, and I'm listening to this podcast, and I really want to incorporate this into my life in some way, what's the best way to find a practitioner or somebody who can assess me using this method?
Well, the first place to start is to find out a little bit more about FMS. You can go to functionalmovement.com, and we have a directory of, I think we're up to about 20,000 people certified around the world that I use myself. If I have an athlete or a client that's going out of town, or I have athletes that are all over the country, and I need to find someone that they can work with when they're in season or they're not with me, the first place I go is on that directory to kind of vet someone that understands this concept, and we can communicate. And the beauty of the movement screen is that it's objective, is that they should get the same scores, in Argentina as they do in LA, as they do in New York. And then we can just interpret those scores differently and then use our own specific skill sets of the best way to approach those scores. But at least we're working off the same scoreboard. So I have someone that Gray just referred to me, who's a triathlete, that originally came to me for their assessment, but now I've taken those results and they're working with one of my other colleagues in Long Island to kind of follow through on the process. And that is even taken a step further with a physical therapist that they work with, but we're all talking the same language. And that's kind of the first place is to find that unit is at functionalmovement.com. You can find our list of practitioners that are not only FMS certified, but also the medical practitioners who are SFMA certified.
Okay. And then typical providers might be physical therapists, chiropractors, medical doctors, athletic trainers.
Yes, that's on the medical side of things, and then you have strength coaches and personal trainers and athletic trainers who are also on the fitness side of things, because that's where we both need each other. And I started 20 years ago, and it was very much a group that didn't play together nice in the sandbox. There was not a lot of great communication when I started out between those two worlds. Well, now it's nice because not only is it created a common language we can use, but also it helps. It doesn't. The misconception is is that people think, well, a person like myself who's not a clinician, it makes me think that I am a clinician. It couldn't be further from the truth. It actually helps keep me in my lane, because now I know, hey, as soon as I have pain, I got to figure out what's going on here. Well, I have my go-to clinicians that I can go to and say, look, this is all the dysfunctions. I'm going to work on this stuff. You kind of figure out the pain side of things, and let's meet back in the middle. And we end up getting really good results, because on their side of things, they're not all that different from the athletic training situation I said earlier. That they can only do so much because of the restraints of time and what insurance provides. And so they need somebody who's going to be that next step where, hey, I can get them out of pain, but they're not ready to go back to their golf or tennis game. They're not ready to get back on the field. I need somebody who's going to get them from where I got them back to where they are to full capacity. And so that's where you have that marriage of those two worlds that you're starting to see more and more now. And it really is to the benefit of the client and patient, because now you have all the steps, and steps don't get skipped. So someone like yourself who comes off an ACL, the physical therapist pretty much a lot of times is restricted to just getting you out of pain and full range of motion. But that doesn't mean you can go back and, start hitting your 5Ks and 10Ks. We need to get you back to running shape, which is not probably where you get left off in most rehab settings. And so then you end up coming back 5 years later with a shoulder issue.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we're just about out of time, Eric. Is there anything that you wanted to leave our listeners and viewers with before we head out?
Well, I always tell everybody in all my courses that I highly encourage people to reach out after the fact with questions, because if you're asking a question, that means I struck a chord somewhere and you were actually listening. So you can reach me on all the different social media sites. It's just Eric, E-R-I-C, Dagati, D-A-G-A-T-I, on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, all those. So, feel free to hit me up with questions, get a dialogue going, and hopefully I can steer you in the right direction.
Awesome. Well, I thought this was pretty great. I think a lot of people who weren't aware of the importance of functional movement before this have a pretty good idea now. And we definitely have a good idea where to find a practitioner, which again, that website was
functionalmovement.com.
Functionalmovement.com. Okay.
Yes.
So perfect. Well, thank you again for taking time out of your day to talk to me and share some knowledge with our listeners. So.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Hopefully we can do it again sometime.
Yeah, I'd love that. So this has been your host, Dr. Coppus, from the Neuro Wellness Podcast. Be well.